Hey, what's up guys? I'm Jared Poirier, and welcome to my movie review show where I talk about movies. Alright, so on today's show, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Normally I do movie reviews, you guys know that, but every once in a while, I just like to tackle a topic related to film in general. And I'm a little bit sick right now, you guys can probably hear that in my voice, but I wanted to shoot this video anyway. This is a video that I've been thinking about for a long time, a video that I've been researching, and a video that I've been hyping. This is my Blockbuster video.
What the hell are you doing? I'm just trying out a different type of content, dude. I thought it might be fun to do a bit of a more research-heavy, deep dive type of video, you know? And that way we could really explore a given topic in film. Nah, dude. We do movie reviews, remember? Look, dude, people are gonna be interested in this. Blockbuster was pretty ubiquitous. Trust me, people remember Blockbuster.
Okay, whatever, dude. But next week we're doing what I want.
God, I hate that guy. Anyways.
So in this video, we're going to be exploring how Blockbuster failed. Basically, all of the elements and all of the dynamics at play that led to Blockbuster going from one of the most successful companies in multimedia to basically being completely obliterated. They kind of no longer exist as a company. And that's what we're going to be discussing in this video, is basically how the hell did Blockbuster go from 9,000 international stores to just one store, which is basically just a Tolkien store, which is in Bend, Oregon. Alright, so this is going to sound a bit weird, but in order to give this story the proper treatment, we actually have to start before Blockbuster even existed as an institution, and we're going to have to start by talking about the format wars of the 1970s. So basically, back in the 1970s, you had two types of formats that you could put video content onto, and of course that is VHS, which we're all very familiar with, and Betamax, which you may have heard of, but probably don't know very much about. But anyway, Betamax was owned by Sony, and VHS was owned by JVC, which is an American company. And at the time, Sony assumed that because Betamax had higher quality, that of course their format was gonna win out. But VHS was playing a bit of a different game. They were going for the library of films that you could have on VHS, and they were going for compatibility. So quality didn't end up mattering that much to the consumers. At the time, people were really just interested in putting together their own film libraries, and they didn't really care that much about the quality of those films. And there are a lot of factors that go into VHS ultimately winning out over Betamax here, but one that isn't actually talked about very often, maybe people are kind of afraid to admit this, but I actually think that pornography played a pretty big role here. Because the fact is that you could get way more porn on VHS than you could get on Betamax. On Betamax you could get like Playboy and a couple of things, but really if you wanted that good library of porn, you had to go VHS, and that's definitely one factor that came into play. I'm not gonna say that, you know, VHS won because of porn, but definitely a factor there, and a factor that is going to come into play as we move deeper into the story of Blockbuster here. So the reason why I wanted to start us off talking about VHS is because I wanted to basically set the mood and establish the fact that when this type of technology was coming out, it was incredibly disruptive. The studios that own the movies that could now be put onto VHSs and traded around were actually pretty upset about this at the time. These companies, of course, they are always resisting new technologies. They thought that this was going to cut into their profits, cut into their bottom line. So initially, studios were very against the idea of people having home libraries on VHS, which meant that if you were a company that wanted to produce VHS tapes with popular movies on them, you would have to pay a licensing fee, and this would be a very heavy fee. This is already a very expensive business to be getting into. And that's exactly what this guy called Andre Blay ended up doing with Video Club of America. And keep in mind that at this point, we aren't even talking about renting movies yet. This is for buying movies. Basically, as a film buff, you could buy movies from Video Club of America, and they would cost you about $50 per video. And even just to set up this business, Andre Blay ended up paying $300,000 to the studios. And that's just the licensing fee. That doesn't even count the cost of the VHS tapes themselves or the cost of transferring information onto those tapes. And that leads us into the next character in the story, George Atkinson. And this is the guy who actually decides that, maybe people don't want to buy that many videotapes. Maybe it's a good idea to just stock up on some videotapes and then rent them out to people. So George Atkinson actually does this with this thing called Video Station, and this is the first time that people can finally rent movies. Alright, so now we're in around 1985, and this is where the guy who you've probably heard of comes into play, David Cook. People who know a little bit about the foundation of Blockbuster probably know this guy's name. What they probably don't know is that he wasn't even a film buff. It was David Cook's wife who liked film. David Cook was in the oil industry, and he was into like statistics and engineering, computer science, not a lot of things that have anything to do with movies at all, in fact. But around the mid-1980s, there's this huge decline in oil prices. I could go into that whole thing too. I have researched it a little bit. But basically the price of crude oil went down quite a bit, and we all of a sudden have a huge crisis in the oil industry. So here we have Cook. He's running out of money, the industry that he's in is completely falling apart, and he decides, well, my wife likes movies, so why don't I open a video rental store? And this is where Cook's background as a data guy really comes into play. And we can see already some of the stuff that Cook was doing that would eventually lead to Blockbuster's monumental, if temporary, success. First of all, if he could streamline or automate a process, he would absolutely do that. This meant that Cook built a system for pretty much everything, organizing the library of VHSs that were in his store. The security is all automated, checkouts are all automated, and all of users' data is actually stored in a giant database. Everything that you do in that store, all of the movies that you rent, how long you've had them out for, all of that information is tied to your account, and it's tied to you as a customer. And all of this data is going to be incredibly important because Cook actually used that to decide which type of content he was going to store in those Blockbuster locations. And Cook actually realized very on, and this is kind of a stroke of genius actually, is that people have very eclectic tastes sometimes, and you can't just focus on one or two types of giant, well, ironically, blockbuster films. You have to focus on a whole wide range of different types of movies. And I'm sure that lots of you guys actually remember this. Going into Blockbuster, you would definitely be able to get your newest releases, but if you were into kind of like weird indie movies or like obscure horror movies, you might be able to find some gems there as well. But in order to cater to all of those different audiences, Blockbusters ended up being stocked with quite a few videotapes. Each new store had about 8,000 videotapes in their stock, and that's about a $400,000 investment just for the tapes themselves. But at this point, that huge cost isn't that big of a deal. There is a huge demand for this type of thing, and they are catering to niche audiences, which ended up being a stroke of genius. And in his first year, Cook was actually able to open up 3 Blockbuster stores. He put down about $12 million on that, and there was very little investor confidence in his idea. He just came out of that huge crisis in the oil industry, and basically he has to prove himself anew as an entrepreneur. So by 1987, Cook has grown Blockbuster quite a bit, but it's also fallen on hard financial times already. And at this point, he decides to sell 1/3 of the company to another gentleman that you may have heard of in connection to this story, Wayne Huizenga. So Wayne Huizenga and a couple of his friends from Waste Management, again, not movie related at all, end up scraping together about $18 million, and they buy a third of Blockbuster. These boys are pretty much going to end up taking control of the entire company, because it's also in 1987 that Cook decides that he wants to basically move on to other ventures. So he accepts a nice $20 million for his share in Blockbuster, and he moves on with his life. And this guy, Wayne Huizinga, he's a pretty different character from David Cook. David Cook was really like an engineer. He was a stats man. He liked to solve problems that were very complex. Wayne Huizinga was the type of guy that wanted full control. And Huizinga hits the ground running. He starts rapidly expanding Blockbuster into 35 locations. And we can see that he continues to implement a lot of the strategies that David Cook had put in place, including doing a lot of market research and making sure that the inventory of those Blockbuster stores reflected that research. And here we see Huizinga also doubling down on the idea that Blockbuster is not a company that deals with porn. Blockbuster continues to not stock porn, and this is going to come into play later in some pretty interesting ways. And this is also the period where Wayne Huizinga decides that he wants to move the headquarters of Blockbuster to Florida. This was a pretty weird decision, and not a lot of people really know why he wanted to do that, but again, this is going to come into play later as well. So throughout 1987, Blockbuster continues their rapid expansion. Blockbuster balloons up to 130 locations. They aren't just opening up their own stores anymore, they're actually buying out a lot of the competition. Like their competitor, Major Video, who Blockbuster bought in 1987 for a nice $92 million. And it's also the year when Blockbuster builds out a giant new warehouse. And this new warehouse is very important because this gives Blockbuster the ability to open a store like that. And Blockbuster continues to open new stores, so much so that by 1989, just 4 years into business, they have 700 locations. And at this point, financial analysts start to wonder how Blockbuster is doing this. And there are some problems brought up here that are definitely going to contribute to Blockbuster's decline and demise. And the fact is that Blockbuster at this point had really built their business on opening new stores. In fact, a third of their revenue came from franchising fees, and that's when you want to open a Blockbuster location. Basically, you have to give Blockbuster a whole bunch of money. Yeah, a third of their revenue is coming from that. And what does that mean? You have to keep opening new stores. Basically, every couple of months you need to open a new store, and eventually the market does become oversaturated. So yeah, people in the press, these financial analysts, they really start to criticize Blockbuster's aggressive and potentially unsustainable business practices. But this criticism does not slow down Blockbuster in any way. Into the early 1990s, they just continue to open new stores. They get up to 1,000 stores. Wayne Huizinga is just not taking any criticism at all, and he's just barreling through. More stores, more Blockbusters. And this is a really weird part of the story, but basically, when people started to ask Wayne why Blockbuster's stock price was decreasing and why interest in the franchise as a whole was decreasing, he actually said that it was because of the Gulf War, that people were watching the Gulf War, so they weren't going to Blockbuster. Pretty weird excuse. And here, Blockbuster starts to face a lot more competition. This is when you have stuff like video on demand and even like DVD mailing services starting to be proposed. And this is when pornography is actually coming into play again, because if you can get like pay-per-view pornography, you're not going to Blockbuster to rent the new like Resident Evil movie or anything anymore. But anyway, the way that Blockbuster decided to address these problems is basically by diversifying. This is when Blockbuster starts to have like all sorts of multimedia stuff. They're going to get into video games, which a lot of us remember, and even music as well. And this is something that continues to plague Blockbuster here. For example, in 1991, when Blockbuster is opening new stores in Spain and Venezuela, they actually did $1.5 billion in sales, and of that, they only made an $89 million profit. And I know $89 million may kind of sound like a lot of money, but when you're doing those kind of sales in the billions figures and you're taking home less than $100 million as a company, something is definitely wrong. But Blockbuster just keeps expanding, and by 1994, there are 3,000 Blockbusters. And this is the year when something really, really bad happens to Blockbuster. In 1994, Blockbuster is purchased by Viacom for $8.4 billion. And Viacom is a massive corporation. You've probably heard of them. They own Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, Universal. Yeah, they own a lot of shit. So yeah, Viacom buys Blockbuster here. And at this point, Wazinga actually decides that this is a good time to leave the company and go own sports teams. And we're going to see things just get worse and worse for Blockbuster here. In this time period, a lot more people have the ability now to own their own movies and fill out their own home libraries. Movies are getting down to that like $20 a movie type of point. And it just gets worse and worse for Blockbuster because Viacom owns them now. Viacom starts to lean really heavily on Blockbuster, basically taking the value that Blockbuster has and using that as leverage to buy other companies. Viacom is making further acquisitions here. They're growing into just a behemoth of a company, and they are squeezing as much value out of Blockbuster as they can in order to drive that growth. And into this whole fucked up situation comes this dude named Bill Fields. And Bill Fields is coming from Walmart, so as soon as he gets there, he fires a whole bunch of people and hires his friends from Walmart. And Bill Fields, with that like general retail background, he thinks that that's the way to go for Blockbuster. So we see Blockbuster getting even more diversified, carrying all types of different products. Bill Fields has all these crazy ideas. Blockbuster should be selling PC systems, upgrading PCs, just a lot of really kooky stuff that isn't really related to their central business model. And Bill Fields ends up leaving within a year, and then most of the people that he hired leave with him. And this guy, Bill Fields, he really makes a mess of things. He hires all this new staff, fires all these other people, and then he decides that he's going to move the headquarters of Blockbuster back to Texas, and then he does that, but then he just quits. Bill Fields is only the CEO of Blockbuster for like a year, and his time at Blockbuster is pretty devastating for the company. After they merge with Viacom, they actually end up losing 40% of their value. And in relocating the headquarters back to Texas, Blockbuster ends up losing 70% of their trained corporate staff. And this is when a guy named John Antioco ends up coming on the scene. He's going to end up rolling back some of those negative changes that Blockbuster was making, basically going back to their core business model, which is renting movies. Antioco ends up selling some of Blockbuster's international stores, and he also sells something called Blockbuster Music, and that's probably why none of us have ever heard of that. But really, these changes are unfortunately too little too late. At this point, the market is really changing. There's so much competition now. You've got DVDs coming out for like a little over 20 bucks a pop, and people can buy these and watch them at home. You've got Amazon coming on the scene and actually like selling something that isn't books. Man, remember when Amazon used to only sell books? The past is weird. Anyways, they start selling movies and all that type of stuff, and that's cutting into Blockbuster's revenue. And of course, we have a little company called Netflix that begins to come on the scene here as well. And since we're speaking of Netflix, at this point, it is pretty surprising, looking back on it, that people didn't really believe in Netflix when it was growing as a company. The fact was that internet speeds were pretty slow. There wasn't really much possibility of streaming high quality content. Netflix was basically mailing people DVDs, and yeah, there just wasn't a lot of confidence that Netflix was going to be able to pull off that business model. At that point, something like a Blockbuster, something a little bit more established, seems more safe. But it's funny because in 1997, there was actually a deal that was on the table. Blockbuster could have bought Netflix for $50 million. To give you guys some perspective, Netflix is now worth over $150 billion. And the story pretty much continues on the same way for Blockbuster. We are definitely in Blockbuster's golden years here. In 2004, Blockbuster gets into the DVD rental game. Now they're competing with Netflix and companies like Redbox. And yeah, really they're just too late. So throughout the 2000s, Blockbuster just gets deeper and deeper in trouble. There's a failed deal with Enron. There's a failed deal to buy Hollywood Video. Just failure after failure here. And Blockbuster also ends up in court a couple times because of late fees. Basically, the deal with late fees is that you're not allowed to charge somebody more in late fees than the content itself is actually worth. So if I have a DVD that's worth $22 at Walmart and I end up renting that from Blockbuster and I keep it for so long that I end up paying $30 in late fees, well, this is actually the case that was brought against Blockbuster, and I think they actually did lose that case. So Blockbuster has this whole struggle where they're trying to make up for those lost revenues by not having late fees and dealing with the problem that people hate late fees, trying to, do a slippery one by us and just call them something else. Oh, these aren't late fees, these are restocking fees. We know they're late fees. So in 2008, this dude James Keyes shows up. And the first thing that he does is try to buy Circuit City for some reason. Circuit City at this point is another failing business, so why he thought it would be a good idea to buy Circuit City, God only knows. And by 2010, things are really looking bad for Blockbuster. Blockbuster is evaluated at around $24 million in 2010. At that point, Netflix is already worth $13 billion. So the New York Stock Exchange ends up delisting Blockbuster. Blockbuster ends up getting sold for very little money to Dish Network. In 2013, they decide to close the remaining 300 Blockbuster stores, leaving only one store left, and that's the one that we spoke about earlier in Oregon. And that's the story of Blockbuster, guys. So here we see a company that went from pretty much dominating the video rental market and having 9,000 stores at its peak to only one store left in the entire world. And I found this to be a really interesting story. Blockbuster is something that we all strongly remember, and it was really, really intriguing for me to dig back into the history, what really happened. And I hope that you guys found that this video was pretty fun too. Alright, so for the comments on this video, go ahead and tell me what is your favorite memory of going to Blockbuster. Other than that, that's going to be it for this video. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I love you guys, and I will see you guys next time. Okay, so credit where credit is due. For this particular video, resource that I utilized that was super beneficial to me was a really amazing podcast by this dude named Jonathan Strickland. John is the host of Tech Stuff on the How Stuff Works network. It's a really excellent podcast if you guys are into computers and technology and all that interesting type of shit, then you guys are gonna love Tech Stuff, so definitely check it out.